Hello, welcome to this workshop on diversity, equity, and inclusion audits, implications, and applications for library and information organizations. I'm Dr. Kwana Bright, and I will be leading this workshop. For today's agenda, we're going to, of course, do a quick welcome and an overview of what we're going to be covering. Then we're going to talk specifically about diversity audits, the what, the why, and the how. Going to give you a break, give everybody a little time to breathe, and then we're going to go into breakout groups and give you an opportunity to talk through the process of creating your own diversity audit plan. You'll be in small groups, hopefully with people who are either in similar organizations or in many cases the same organization as you, so that your discussions make sense, so that it really does resonate when you have questions, because you're probably going to be sharing questions with others, and then also the topics and the information that make the most sense for your organization are just as likely to make the most sense for others in your group. Then we'll take another break, and then we will come back and share out a little bit of information. We can't have all groups share. There's quite a few of you here, but we will get a chance for a few to share out some of the main highlights of the discussions that take place, questions, of course, and then wrap-ups. We'll have plenty of time today to address multiple questions. Please do not be shy to also, if you have questions during this first part of the workshop, to drop those directly into the chat. I will likely be addressing them in the lecture that I'm doing this morning, because the first part is very much overview lecture, but just in case, it's always good for me to know those questions are theirs, and that way if I don't address them directly in the lecture, I'll know that I need to address them at some point during the workshop. So just a quick note on those breakout groups. So for the breakout group part of the workshop, I have placed you into groups based on type of organization, as I mentioned. Most of you who were in the same organization in terms of your institution have probably been grouped together. If there were only a few of you, you might have been grouped with others from similar types of institutions or organizations. If for some reason you want or need to be in a group with someone else that you know is at this workshop, but they might possibly be in a different institution, we don't know. We've set up the groups, but we don't know where you might like to go. You can send Jessica a chat, in a private chat, to let her know that you would like to be in a group with a specific person. Share that name, and we'll see if we need to work some magic to make sure everyone ends up in the group that they need to end up in. And we'll have plenty of time to do that. That won't be taking place until the second part of the workshop, which is about an hour into our session. So, as I mentioned, welcome. I am Dr. Kwana Bright. I'm here because, well, I was invited for one, but also because I'm very much passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion in libraries and information organizations, specifically the assessment of DEI, which I know is something that libraries struggle with. We struggle with assessment in general. We specifically struggle with assessment of DEI, and what I'm hoping to do today is offer you some needed information about this process of doing a diversity, equity, inclusion audit, which is an important type of assessment that needs to take place in our organizations. So to get us started, I do want to, since we can't do the usual go around the room, introduce ourselves, which would be nice. I miss seeing people in person as well. But I'd like to know why you're here today. I want to give everyone a chance to maybe tell me what you hope to take away from this workshop. So I have created a Padlet. I'm going to put this link for the Padlet directly into the chat. I invite everyone to hop over to the Padlet and take a look, see around, post what you hope to take away from this workshop today. This is twofold for me. One, it gives me a chance to get some engagement, make sure you're not all just sitting there listening today, let you move around a little bit, at least mentally move around a little bit. But also it gives me a good idea of what your interests are. And once again, another way for me to make sure I'm covering everything that you need for me to cover in this particular session. So, diversity audits, this is the what, the why, and the how. So just to get started, of course, you always want to make sure you have a definition of what you're working on. And diversity audits are a way of examining a diversity strategy, culture, systems, procedures against some type of strategic analysis framework. And you use this framework to identify the aspects that are working well and which ones might need a little more attention, which ones, there might not be enough information about. And then that's an important part of this audit process, because a lot of times when people think of a diversity, equity, inclusion audit, a diversity audit, they get caught up on this idea of finding out what's wrong. and they lose sight of finding what's right. So think of it as, the idea that we often go into situations where we talk about people having a deficit model. Well, we're going to go in same way here, thinking about our organizations. We don't want to necessarily automatically assume that we're going to have deficits. What are the assets that we have? What are we doing really well? What do we need to celebrate and make sure we're building on? And so an audit is really a good audit is structured to do both of those things. Now, these audits are based on specific practical diversity action plans and strategies. And so what you're really trying to do with this audit is figure out exactly what's going on, make sure that you're looking at addressing it in a practical way and coming up with strategies. But these audits are also a way for you to benchmark and to track your improvements. And so I'm going to talk a lot about baselining and creating a baseline with your initial audit. To be honest with you, if your goal is not to check in on this information after a few months, after a year, after a couple years, then you don't need to do an audit. I'm going to be honest with you there. Audits are designed to help you start from this is where we're at. And in some cases, you're going to see yourself being really high on certain things. And in other cases, you're going to see yourself being kind of low, and you're not going to see where you're doing a lot of effort. And so it's really important that you take the time to think about what's going to happen when I check in next year. Am I going to see improvement in these areas? I'm going to see decline in those areas, and then be able to account for what happens. And so that's an important part of this process. So diversity audits are systemic organizational change processes. And so there's a scary word. I just said change process. This is what a true diversity audit is. If you act on what you find in your diversity audit, your organization is going to change. And if you're not ready to take on that change, then you're not ready for a diversity audit. Now, diversity audits are also methods for determining an organization's current state. And I said I'm going to keep saying this because it's really important that you understand you need that baseline information. It is necessary to help guide the planning and to set that baseline for assessing your progress. And then also you can think of them as a critical SWOT analysis. And I think a lot of people might even prefer that terminology because most of you probably have either had to do a SWOT analysis or have read SWOT analyses done by other people. And it's a pretty standard process. We go in looking for our strengths, our weaknesses, our opportunities, and our threats. And we recognize that in this particular case, when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion audit, we do that specifically for topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So SWOT analysis, if it helps you to think about your audit in that way, or if you want to plan your audit in that way, nothing wrong with that. Please proceed. You're going to be just fine. You're going to be able to still get the same answers that you would normally get from using a different method. And don't worry, we're going to talk about different methods that are available to you as well. So first things first though, what do we even mean by diversity? And this conversation, of course, has gone on and on and on, especially in our field. We have run the gamut. We've been through multiculturalism, we've been to diversity, we've been to diversity, equity, inclusion. We've now kind of progressed a little bit closer to things like social justice and anti-bias and anti-racism. But the important part about this, and the reason we have to have this conversation, is because you can't properly assess anything if the meaning is going to change or if people are going to be interpreting it differently. It's basically be like trying to compare apples and oranges. And you can say, yeah, they're both fruits. That's great, but they're not the same fruit, and you really shouldn't try to compare them, at least not using the same criteria. You wouldn't want to say, well, this apple, we're going to compare them on crispness. Well, of course, your apple should be crisp. I don't know if you want a crisp orange, or at least not using that terminology. So you just have to be careful about what you mean when you go out to do your audit. What are you actually trying to look at? And so really the first thing is, do we have any agreed upon definitions? So second time for you guys to get a little involved, so I'm not just talking at you for this first hour. I want everybody to head over to this new Padlet, which I will put the link directly into the chat for us here. And what we're going to be looking at in this second Padlet is give us some definitions. Now, you'll notice multiple columns. And you don't have to give a definition for all. Please do not think you have to fill them all in. And this is also not a competition. No, there won't be this definition is better. I just want to see where people are with their thoughts on these particular different topics that are related to diversity, equity, inclusion. So what's your definition? And no cheating, no heading out to Google this, no heading out to look it up in the dictionary. I just want your thoughts on how you would define these different things. And so let's take about 5 minutes and see what pops up in our little Padlet here. All right, so now that I've tortured you, made you come up with those definitions yourself, let's talk about some common definitions. And I happen to pull these from two particular sources, or one particular source in terms of these first three, but you can find multiple definitions for these things. And yes, there are a lot of definitions that have already been created that your organization may decide to adopt and agree on, or to take up and make some changes so that it matches your particular needs. So diversity is the presence of difference within a given setting. And I think we can all agree that's very broad and probably a little too broad for the work you're trying to do. So if you did start with a definition like this, the first thing you would want to do is make that more narrow and figure out what it truly means for your setting. But if you need a starting point, that's a starting point. Equity, of course, a little bit more specific. It's an approach that ensures everyone access to the same opportunities. Still a little broad because you can decide what opportunities mean in your organization, but at least you're probably getting a little closer to having something that's more definitive than just diversity. And then the same thing with inclusion. It's about folks with different identities, feelings, and or being valued, leveraged, and welcomed within a given setting. And so once again there, if your setting happens to be libraries, what does it look like? If your setting happens to be information organization, what does it look like? If your setting happens to be a museum, what does it look like for you? For there to be different identities or feelings or being valued, leveraged, and welcome. And then social justice has a much longer definition. And part of the reason behind this is because unlike diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice is really seen as more of an overarching system, or at least an overarching thought process or approach. So the definition I pulled happened to come from the Center for Economic and Social Justice, and they describe this as this virtue that guides us in creating those organized human interactions we call institutions. So you can see how this is probably a little bit bigger. And if you're looking at auditing for social justice, which you can, just recognize right away that you're probably doing audits that are looking at sub pieces of social justice, and that social justice just happens to be your overarching theme. And so in turn, social institutions, when justly organized, provide us with access to what is good for the person, both individually and in our associations with others. And so you would probably be looking at auditing things like collaborations and associations and individuals working together, and also this idea of personal responsibility. So all that comes into play if you start introducing something like social justice into an audit for your organization. And then the final definition I wanted to pull was just the one for anti-racism. And once again, unlike diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism is really more, in this case, as described by NAC's International Perspectives, it's an active process. It's something you're doing, identifying and eliminating racism by changing the systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, attitudes. And I think what we could probably argue in this particular case is that anti-racism is part of what we get out of doing a true diversity, equity, and inclusion audit. That in theory, we're being anti-racist in our process, or at least we're hopefully being anti-racist in that process. All right, so the next thing you need to think about. So we've kind of given a basic idea of what an audit is, and why people do them. But what do you want from your audit? And you really need to think about how you're planning to use the findings. And part of your audit plan should actually include the after the audit plan. So we've got this great plan. We're going to do all this stuff. But what are you going to do with that information? And that goes back to my question of whether or not you plan to repeat it or not. And I'm going to continue to make the statement that if you're not planning to repeat it, you don't need to do the audit. Sorry, if you're not checking for progress, you're not doing true assessment. You need to know whether or not you've had improvement or whether or not there's been decline. So those baselines and setting those benchmarks are really important for this process. And also, are you ready for what you might find? And for many institutions, this is the most difficult part of this process. Doing an audit for diversity, equity, and inclusion can be ugly for some institutions. And that's just me being truthful. It's usually ugly because a lot of effort hasn't been put into those areas in the past. And if no effort has been put in there, put into that process of having diversity, improving equity, improving inclusion, you're going to not fare too well with an audit because you're going to come out of your audit looking like you've done nothing. But what I want people to recognize is that that's okay, because once again, this is your baseline. And this means now that you have room to grow. You can go up from here. It's hard to go down if you've got nothing, right? So you can definitely go up. And you can easily, unlike a lot of institutions, probably see a lot of improvement because, hey, you're starting from zero. So it's really important that if you do an audit like this, that you don't get discouraged by what will come across as failure. That's what a lot of people feel. We failed the audit. But remember, an audit's not a test. An audit is really more of an inventory, a way for you to look at your efforts and your engagement in different things. And it's a way for you to give yourself something to plan for or shoot for. And then once again, as it says, many of you are going to have positive things that show up on your audit as well. You just may find you have fewer positive and more negative, and that's okay. So I want everyone to be okay with what they find, but you need to be ready for that as well. This isn't one of those tests where you've had plenty of time to practice and plan for it, and there's an open book and you've got the teacher there and you've got your partners. That's not what's happening with this audit. What this is a chance for you to kind of break your organization wide open and really look at what's going on within your organization. And sometimes that's not pretty. That's not what we want to see. But this is a chance for you to go in and make those things pretty and make them look the way you want them to look. Because if you really care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, then you want to do this audit. You want to find the bad. You want to see the good. You want to make sure that everything is working the way you want it to work. So as part of this process, I did want to show you an audit that I have created that typically is most useful to academic libraries, but has the potential to be restructured and used for other types of organizations. And the reason I want to show this to you is because I want you to see the types of things that you typically would want to look at within an audit. And what better way to do that than to actually show you an example of an audit. So the one that I'm showing you, I just tend to call it the DASA. I've given it a nickname because it's an acronym. It's too many letters. Oh my goodness. So I call it the DASA. So DASA is my friend. And so this is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Self-Assessment Audit that I have created and been working on for the last few years. It has not been completely perfected. It's still got some holes in it like any good audit will, but I think it will be useful for many to see this as an example as well. And so let's break down what the DASA really looks at. And so it's looking at your organization and all these different pieces that go into it. And the original DASA was structured on an organizational development idea called the Galbraith STAR model. And I don't put this in a STAR model anymore because, one, it takes up too much space, but also I prefer this imagery. But it looks at these 6 specific aspects of an organization. So it's looking at your strategy, your structure, your processes, your people, rewards, and then also the environment or the external things that may be impacting the organization or that you may be impacting. So that one should actually be an arrow going both directions. But this is what it's kind of broken down into. But what does this actually look like if you're taking a look at these different sections? So if you're looking at strategy, you're looking at your strategic planning, your mission statements, your vision statements, your values, if you have any written out, internal policies, any diversity equity plans you may already have in place, any diversity definitions or diversity statements you may have already created, whether or not they've been made truly public or not. So I want to emphasize that as well. Just because something is not available to the public does not mean that it doesn't impact your institution or impact your organization. I've worked at a number of libraries where there have been a lot of understood ideas about certain things that might show up on the internal drive but not on the external website. It still impacts your organization, and since people doing this audit are internal, part of the organization, they can comment on those things. They can share that information. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of is that as we push forward looking at these different parts of the DASA and other audits, there is overlap in many of these things, because even when you're starting to look at something like the strategy, strategic planning is part of that strategy, of course. But a lot of people will argue that strategic planning also shows up in the structure of your organization. And I would say, yes, it does. And so part of, this audit places it in one location. You might decide to look at it in a different way and approach it as a process. You may decide to approach it as part of your structure. And that's okay. as I mentioned, the DASA is not going to work for every organization. It's just an example of a way to try to at least start that process of assessing your organization. So what does this look like if you're actually looking at the DASA? What I've done is put it into, in this particular case, it happens to be in Qualtrics. And what it does is it asks you to work together as a team at your organization to determine where you fall within these 5 areas. So whether or not your efforts or your level of engagement towards these actions are non-existent, all the way up to expert. And what does it mean to be expert or non-existent? Don't worry, I'll tell you more about that later. But taking a closer look at this, you're talking about, in this case, 8 particular statements that work towards the strategy of your organization. And this is where I mentioned all those things: strategic planning, your mission, your vision, your values. You're looking at them individually. Now, I would even argue that to make this even stronger, we could split this out and look specifically at diversity in your strategic plan, and equity in your strategic plan, and inclusion in your strategic plan. And to be honest with you, truly that's what should be done here. Unfortunately, doing that, of course, makes this, take this number of entries and multiply it by 3. You now have 24 entries to look at. Now multiply that by the number of entries we also have for the other sections. How long is it going to take you to complete this process? I actually encourage people to do this mentally, to kind of think through this process and break it down mentally, even if it's not completely broken down in these particular sections. And then if you're looking at what's actually rated here, as I mentioned, you can go from non-existent, which means it's not even being considered, it doesn't exist in your organization, all the way up to being an expert. And when you're an expert at something, it means that not only is it fully integrated into your organization, but it's been there for a while, you've been collecting data on it, and you can already assess what's been happening with it, where it started at, where it's doing, where it's at now, where it's going to go in the future. And you may even be at the point where you're sharing that with others. That's what you're talking about when you're an expert on something, if you're engaging at an expert level with something. You'll also notice there's a column for non-applicable. And that always needs to be something you have with an audit like this that's been kind of constructed to be used by multiple locations, because it doesn't apply to every type of organization, and that's perfectly fine. You need to be able to see that and show that it's okay that we don't have this particular thing in our organization. It doesn't apply to us. You'll also notice that there is another subsection for comments, notes, and evidence. And I specifically say evidence here because part of doing this type of rating system, part of using something like this to audit something, is that you need to be able to provide concrete evidence to support your rating. So if you're going to tell me that you are an expert on having diversity, equity, inclusion in the library strategic plan, that you've been engaged in that, I want evidence of that. I want to see either a link to your strategic plan at a minimum. I want to see passages from your strategic plan, maybe the multiple goals or objectives that you've highlighted that actually align with this, or comments and notes. So if it's non-existent, you can make a comment that says, wow, I never thought about this. This is something we really need to be looking at. Or maybe a note is, I said non-existent here, and we're saying non-existent because we've been having internal conversations about it, but we haven't really done anything with it. Now, I might argue there that if you're saying that, I'm going to push you towards novice, but you still want to have those notes and comments there to help you reason out why you got to the rating that you selected for these different items. And that's what an audit is. An audit is a chance for you to actually specifically have these conversations. We all need to recognize that it's very unlikely that one person in our organization is going to know every single thing about how diversity, equity, and inclusion have been taking place in the organization. You need to be able to collect and hear the voices of multiple people in your organization. The more the merrier, yes, especially in this case. So let's take a look at a couple of the other sections, because I think people are probably curious to see what shows up there. So if we're talking about the structure, this is where you're talking about your decision-making process. This is where you might put assessment, dedication and commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. Communication, specifically internal communication, shows up in this section. Are you acknowledging diversity, equity, and inclusion within the work that you're actually doing in your organization? Any collaborative efforts that are taking place, and then also the big one, the financial resources. Are you committing money to this work as well? So very similar to what we've seen in the other section I looked at. In this case, there's also 8 entries here that specifically talk about the decision-making process. And you'll notice here that the emphasis happens to be on administration. And that's because of the importance of having administration involved in this process. And so this process just runs through the same thing. Don't worry, I will be providing a link to the DASA for anyone who's interested in looking at it and also playing around with it. And so this is not something that you're going to not be able to see again. This is something I actually make freely available for people to take a look at. And so if we're talking about processes, you're talking about data collection, decision making. Once again, it shows up twice. Training and learning opportunities in terms of how they are created and how they're made available. Programming services in terms of you're working with your different consumers, your users, your patrons, whatever you choose to call them. Collection development shows up here, and also your feedback processes. And you could add more to this. So think about the work you do in your institution, your organization. What are some major processes that you're involved in that you think need to be looked at? And you would definitely want to add that to this particular list of things you want to look at. And so this is what this looks like. There's also 8 items for the processes section within the DASA. Now under rewards, you start talking about things like salary and compensation, bonuses, professional development, tenure, promotion, evaluations, and professional contributions. Now the professional contributions are things where people in your organization are rewarded for their professional contributions related to DEI, whether they take place internal to the library, at your overarching institution organization, or external in your professional realms. And so that one is something that's often overlooked in our field, and something that I really emphasize including when you're looking at something like rewards for auditing your organization. And this section only has 7 entries. It doesn't get much smaller, to be honest. It actually gets a little longer. But there's only 7 entries here, but you could easily add things to something like this. You could easily add on more things that you wanted to look at in this process. And then your people, this is where you start looking at your demographic representation, your climate, employee assessment and evaluation, which a lot of people also would put under processes. So how you do your assessment evaluation, also the nature of those assessment evaluations are things you want to look at. Engagement opportunities. So are people given opportunities to engage with DEI within the organization, within the institution, within their work, education training in terms directly for what people have access to, and then also the value of the DEI work they give. So you notice once again there's overlap here, and that's perfectly fine because we sometimes want you to refocus in terms of how it applies. So looking at the value of DEI work in terms of your people might be more specific to looking at the specific work that they are asked to do within the organization, whether or not people are required to do DEI work because of their demographic status versus their interest in doing that work. Those are the types of conversations you're probably more likely to have there. And then even within the employee assessment evaluation, you can talk about the valuing of DEI work in terms of whether or not you actually allow it to be assessed as important work the person is doing. And so those are 10 items on this particular thing, and you'll notice that there's a lot of emphasis on using demographic data. Do you have access to that data? One thing we have trouble with in our field is we talk a lot about recruitment. We sometimes mention how difficult retention is, and we don't really talk about the in-between. And so one thing that we always talk about is that people celebrating how that they've hired multiple people from various underrepresented groups, backgrounds in the organization are often missing one important piece of that conversation is how many have they retained. Because if you have a revolving door at your organization because you don't have retention, then you're not actually doing as well as you thought you were with that process. So that's an example of one of the things that's broken into 2 specific sections here because of the importance of looking at both the initial representation, the recruitment aspect, and also the retention related to demographic groups as well. Now, environment external is usually one of the ones that is easily avoided by a lot of organizations because partly because people want to focus more internally first. But in some cases, your organization may be doing really well internally and not so well externally. And depending on what your external community is, you may need to focus on them when you're doing your audit. And so once again, you can take a look at things like your partnerships. This is where you determine whether you've been doing proper community analyses, community climate assessments, programming, services that are offered, your collections in terms of how they relate directly to your external environment, the communities that use your organization, communication and outreach to that environment, and then service to the field also shows up here as well. And that's another 10 set here, and just kind of gives you an opportunity to see how those are looked at. And in this particular case, you notice you start looking at things like gaps in your programming and gaps in your services related to your external community. And so you start noticing some qualifiers showing up a little bit to help you understand what you might need to look at. Because our assumption here with our external community is that we're doing something, we're doing some work with our community, but really, the real question is, do we have any gaps? Do we have any holes in our level of engagement with looking at this information? Have we considered that we have gaps that we need to fill as well? So looking at all that, really it comes down to, and I kind of already showed you that listing at the top. You could already see what was being covered, but what are you actually measuring? I mean, what you're doing all this, what are you actually measuring? And so for the particular data that I look at, it's really about engagement, but it's kind of also couched as effort. But you can do an audit to look at your effort levels, your ability to do the work, your focus on the work, your progress towards the work, and also whether or not you've improved in those areas. And the last two specifically, progress and improvement, come with that whole idea of baselining and benchmarking. Now, I keep mentioning benchmarking, and it's an important part of auditing. I do want to kind of put an asterisk out here right now and say we do want to be careful about benchmarking. Benchmarking needs to be done, once again, with similar institution types and organizations. It does you no good to benchmark yourself against a Harvard if you are a small liberal arts college. It does you no good as a community college to benchmark yourself against the large state university, because you're not even playing the same game in many cases. So don't create this idea of benchmarking yourself based on things that aren't realistic. Benchmark yourself, if you want to, with organizations that are similar, especially if those organizations are already organizations you collaborate with. Those are great benchmarking partners, so you work together on your auditing. Maybe you all decide to go in and do the audit together so that you can actually all work together to make improvements and learn from each other in that process. But back to what this thing you're actually measuring. So here's the definition of the different areas that if you're using the data that you're asked to look at. So as I mentioned, if your efforts or your engagement are non-existent, then the activity is not in place or not even currently being considered by the library. If you're a novice, you're considering the activity, but there's nothing concrete in place yet. You don't really have anything going. If you're at intermediate level, you've implemented or started it, or started doing the work towards it, but you don't quite have any data yet. You can't really evaluate how you're doing. If you're at an advanced level, you're actively engaged in the activity or item, you're doing the work, and you've got some data there that you can actually use if you need to evaluate the impact, but maybe you haven't gotten around to actually checking that data yet. And if you're an expert, you're fully engaged in the activity item, the data is available and has already been used to evaluate the impact of the activity or item. So I think you can see how this is one of those escalating scales in terms of level of engagement, level of effort being put into the different work areas of work that you're being asked about within this particular audit instrument. And so now that we've run through all that, and I've kind of shown you an example of one type of diversity audit, we're going to talk about how to conduct a diversity audit. So what are those building blocks you need to have in place? And what are you going to be looking at when you go into your small groups in terms of putting all this together? So first of all, it's essential for you to determine who. And what I mean by who is who in your organization, which members are going to be participating in this audit. And I'm going to give you kind of fair warning now. It needs to be more than one person. It doesn't even matter if that one person happens to be the dean, director, head, boss, whatever you want to call them. You need more than one person involved in this process. As I said earlier, it's very difficult for one person. Unless you are a one-person organization, which I don't think any of us are working at, it's very difficult for one person to actually know everything about the diversity, equity, inclusion work going on or not going on in their organization. So you do need to make sure you're identifying all people in your organization and possibly external to your organization who will be participating in this audit process. You also need to determine the what, which is going to be the aspects of the organization that are going to be audited. You need to determine the how, which processes will you apply to conduct your audit. and the when. So when are you going to actually try to get all this done, which is always the tough part with our schedules and trying to figure out what's going to work best for your organization. So let's go back and look at this a little more in a little more detail so I can give you some helpful, hopefully, information to think about when you're figuring this out. So in terms of who's going to be involved, I tend to divide this into the leaders and the participants. And when you're thinking about your leaders, you want to determine if this is going to be a top-down, so a top-driven process, or a bottom-up process. And if it's going to be top-down, you want to make sure that those who are at lower levels in the organization understand that they are being asked to be fully engaged because their voices are important, not because they're being forced to do it or told to do it. And that can be very difficult sometimes. Now, bottom up, of course, from those working at the bottom of the organization or at the lower levels of the organization lead this process? They can, but I'm going to be honest, it's going to be difficult. They'd have to have some buy-in for them to be able to move forward. So from the bottom, you can easily do an audit. You can easily figure out where you're at. It's usually more difficult to implement change and move forward from that process. Other participants, you want to determine if you want to do internal only or if you want to invite the external in as well. I typically tell people start with the internal and worry about the external depending on how closely related they are to your organization and their availability. Now, if the external is a group that is highly important to your organization in terms of your ability to do your work, then you probably want to include them. Which for most of us, our users, our patrons, are highly important for us, but sometimes you want to focus on the internal first, get your own house in order before you start worrying about the little houses you've been building for others. That's one way to look at it. Now, what are you actually going to audit? So, are you going to do the whole organization? Remember I mentioned this idea of breaking your organization open and looking at all the ugly parts of the inside. Yeah, you can decide to do that. Typically, those who are doing the whole organization are focusing in on the strategy, the structure, and the processes of the organization. Doesn't mean you're not also looking at the people, the rewards, and the external. And remember, this is how I chose to divide this, not necessarily how you might choose to look at this. But most of the time, if you're doing the whole organization, you're really going in for those pieces that build your organization up, those building blocks. If you're only looking at parts of the organization, a lot of times people will start with the people, the rewards, and the external pieces because maybe they're more focused on those aspects of the work. There's no right or wrong here. This is really about what's best for your organization and what you're trying to accomplish. This is why we go back to that question of why are you doing this audit in the first place? What are you hoping to get out of it? And if your focus is more on the people, that's perfectly fine. You focus on the people. If it's more on the rewards, that's perfectly fine as well. But if you really care about the organization as a whole, that structure, that strategy, the processes, then most people will typically go into this process of trying to look at the organization as a whole. Now, I do want to say at this point that even if you go into this process looking at the organization as a whole, when it gets to the point of getting the results of your audit and looking at what you have, you're going to have to make a decision because you cannot possibly address every single thing you're going to find in your audit process. It's not going to happen. You are going to have to make some strategic decisions about what you're going to address first. Are you going to tackle the low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff? You're going to go after the really hard stuff? You're going to tackle stuff in the middle? Some combination of all of the above? That's something you have to have a conversation about with you in your organization. But I don't want to say that like, oh no, you can't fix it all at the end to dissuade you from looking at your whole organization. I actually encourage everyone to go ahead and do the whole organization process and make those decisions based on the data that you actually collect. Now, which approach? Do you want to keep this all internal or do you want to do it externally as well? Internal means that you do the work. This means that you identify people in your organization, you pull all this stuff together, you do all the background, the research, the work to create the audit process, and you take care of also the analysis, the reporting out, and all the future planning. This means you're taking care of all the surveys, the focus groups, the content analysis of your policies and your collections and all those things, the process reviews that are going to be really important, and maybe you do all this in small group projects because it's probably going to be the best approach that you can take. If you choose the external route, this means going out and getting access to some type of commercial survey or assessment instrument that already exists out there, hiring consultants, or maybe even using the data as the building block approach and working with someone like me to use that instrument to give you this large scale overview. External approaches tend to be large scale. That tends to be the very nature of them. They just tend to work that way. Internal approaches tend to be a little bit smaller because you work in bite-sized pieces with what you have. Now, if you're a larger institution that also happens to have, let's say your own assessment team, you can probably pretty much do this at the same scope as an external group can do if you're willing to route them away from their other work at the same time. And that's really where the decision-making process comes in. To do this work, to really do it well, takes a lot of time and effort from the people who are involved. And you need to be okay with certain people having to drop certain aspects of the job they've been doing for a while to do this work, if you're doing this internal approach. Even if you're doing the external approach, though, please do not think that this is a way for you to be completely hands-off in the process. An external approach means that you're asking someone else to come in and help you with this process, but they still have to talk to you. They still have to talk to the people who work there. They still have to kind of dig through your organization, and that means that you have to be present for that process, and that means that your time is still going to be taken. Is it less time? Oh yes, much less time. Especially in terms of all the people who would be asked to participate. But there will likely be a few people in your organization, one or two people, who will spend more time working with the external people or the external groups that you hire, because someone has to be the conduit in. Now, the other nice thing about the external piece, as a lot of you probably have realized, is that sometimes this topic can get pretty contentious. Not every organization has handled it very well. And it can be very difficult for some employees to feel comfortable speaking up and speaking out. And in an internal process, that makes it even tougher, because the people that they're asked to talk to are their colleagues. And in many cases, I hate to tell you this, the people they're asked to talk to may be the ones who have been bullying them for years, or gaslighting them for years, or microaggressing them for years. And they don't feel comfortable now participating in a survey or a focus group with those people, or being in a small group to do a content analysis with those people, because they don't feel they can actually express themselves. You have to understand that about the internal process. The external process often frees those people up to have at least a conduit to share what's going on and share their input about these different things. But when you're talking about an audit, it's really hard for people to distinguish between an audit and a climate assessment. A climate assessment is very personal, and it can be part of an audit, something you decide to do because you did the audit and realized that the climate wasn't great. But an audit is not a climate assessment. It's really looking at the processes and the structures and what's going on for the organization. But that doesn't mean that personal things don't tend to creep into the conversations that take place when people are trying to determine whether or not they're engaged in this work or not. And so you want to be ready for that. And having an external group there to help you with that can make your life a little bit easier in some cases, because those people have someone they can talk to that hopefully will give them that level of protection to feel like they can speak openly. But it also still introduces this other idea that whether or not they can trust the external people who you're hiring, those types of things. Now, your timeline, of course, is also going to be a really important part of this. So, fair warning, this is not a short-term process, but you can complete parts of it over short periods of time. You want to think about things like, am I going to align this with our strategic planning process? Might not be a bad idea, especially if you want to build it into the strategic planning process as part of what you're planning to do. Are you going to align this with your financial or budget timelines? Because maybe that's an important piece of this as well. Especially if you're thinking about the external route, you might have to think about whether or not you have the funds to pay for the consultants to do this work. Are you going to align this with your assessment and review timelines? That can be a difficult choice. You want to think about the fact that, as I mentioned, you need people to work with each other. You need time. People need time together. And if you're aligning this with the assessment review timeline where people are already stressed about trying to finish up their assessment evaluation process, I remember the days of writing those letters. I'm in the middle of the tenure process right now. It's very difficult to ask them to say, oh, and by the way, we're going to be participating in this auditing process as well, on top of everything else you're doing. So sometimes when you think about your timeline, you want to actually think about how you can fit this in so that it doesn't create this stop, for other work that's happening? Is there any way you can make it a little more seamless where it kind of just flows into the process? Are there times where your institution has a little more downtime where people can focus on this type of work? Can this become a project that you do during those downtimes, one of those projects that we used to always create and come up with that we're going to take care of during the December break, because that's the only time we're going to be able to focus on it when we don't have patrons and students. We're in the middle of a pandemic. This is the perfect time to focus on this because we don't have to worry about those things. If that's the case, then that's the perfect time to do it. And you want to be able to focus on doing that work during this time. But you definitely want to be strategic about this process. And you want to think about what's going to be best for the organization in the long run and least taxing on your resources that you have available to do this work. So that is the gamut of all the information about the what's and the whys and the hows. I knew I just threw this all at you. We've got plenty of time to do some questions right now. I shouldn't say plenty. We got about 5 minutes before break time for questions. And then we're going to go into the actual workshopping aspect of this, of the workshop. But any questions right now? And let's go ahead and take those. And then if no questions right now, let's go ahead and drop into our break. We'll get an extra 5 minutes for that break. And when we come back, we're going to dive right into the workshops. I'll explain a little bit more about the groups that you're going to be working in and how we're going to be sharing some information with each other, collecting some information about this process.